Welcome, everybody, to the Inner Carnivore Podcast, Season 2, Episode 8. My guest today is someone that I was very excited to talk to, given the concerns that carnivores always get about heart health. My guest today is a board-certified cardiac surgeon and founder of Ovadia Health, and the author of Stay Off My Operating Table. I'm extremely excited to announce Dr. Philip Ovadia as my guest. If you guys are interested in supporting the show, it takes 5 seconds, it's completely free. Like it, rate it, leave a review, comment on the show, send it to a friend. It helps immensely, and I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Welcome, everybody, to the show. I have my guest here, Dr. Philip Ovadia. How are you doing today, sir?
I am doing great, JT. Great to be here with you and spend some time with you and your audience.
Yes, I'm very excited, mainly because going carnivore, carnivore, keto, anything that has a lot of red meat, inevitably we get told we're going to have heart disease 1,000 times. So as a cardiac surgeon, I love to be able to bring in experts. What I am also interested in, and I've had the good fortune of being able to talk to a lot of different doctors in a lot of different disciplines, and I'm always interested in what you were taught, right? Like obviously you went through all of the medical school, you went through all of the residencies, the trainings, and I know you have your own personal story, which I would love to get into also. But when you come out of medical school, right? And obviously as a cardiac surgeon, it would behoove you to know why you have to operate in the first place, right? Like what's causing this? What were your views on what was causing heart disease? Because I mean, it's right in the middle of this heart disease boom. That's, the number one killer in the United States.
Yeah. And, that's a great question, right? And the irony is it's a question that didn't really get discussed a lot, right? Why are we so busy as heart surgeons? Why is there so much heart disease? Now, so I'm going to go back, right? I finished medical school, and at first I did training in what's called general surgery, right? Sort of broad-based surgical training. And then it was time to decide what area of surgery I wanted to specialize in. And I was very drawn to heart surgery, to cardiac surgery, because of the combination of the sort of technical expertise that are involved in doing the surgery and just the physiology of the heart and operating on the heart. That combination really spoke to me. And, I was discouraged from going into cardiac surgery. This is early 2000s, 2001, 2002 that I'm making this decision. And my surgical mentors all said, don't go into heart surgery. It is a dead field. There's going to be nothing left for you to do in, 20 years because, we have all these medications. The statins were, this was kind of the peak. Statins had just become, or at that point were, the most widely used class of medications. And, it was felt that heart disease was figured out, right? We take care of cholesterol and there's going to be no more heart disease. And, there's going to be nothing left for you to do as a heart surgeon. But, I decided to still go into heart surgery. Here I am 20 plus years later, busier than ever. There is actually a shortage of heart surgeons in this country. There aren't enough surgeons to do all the heart surgery that really needs to be done. So obviously, what we thought was the answer to heart disease has turned out not to be the case. We all know the statistics, right? Heart disease, far and away the number one killer, has been that way for 70 years now and really shows no signs of slowing down. It's actually been getting worse over the past decade or so. And so that should lead all of us, right? All physicians who deal with heart disease should be stepping back and saying why. And yet it's a question that doesn't get asked. It doesn't get discussed. And, through my personal journey, which we'll get into, how that led me to start thinking about maybe this narrative that I've been told, that I was taught around what causes heart disease isn't correct. That's been a big question in my life over the past 10 years as I've been on this journey, and have now really come to discover that, what we were told causes heart disease is not what causes heart disease. And doing something like eating a whole bunch of red meat, which we were told is bad for the heart, Turns out that that is very good for the heart and is now what I recommend to people to prevent and treat heart disease. So we'll certainly get into all the details there.
That is crazy. Like 20 years ago, you're being told that it's a dead field, right? And now, and I'm glad you brought up that it's getting worse, because I tried to do a bunch of research on this, and for whatever reasons, you can call it Google, censored information, whatever it is, finding the incident rate of actual heart disease online is very difficult. Like, it's really difficult to find. You can find death rates, right? And everything talks about death rates going down, but finding the actual number of cases of heart disease by year, I can't even get ChatGPT to do it. They'll go, well, back in the 60s, it wasn't really, they didn't have a whole lot of information. Back in the 80s, they didn't have a whole lot of information. Death rate's going down. I'm like, what? I'm not asking about death rate. I'm talking about like incidence rate. And so, like, to hear that you're being told just 20 years ago, right, not that long ago, that this is kind of a dead field, and it's driven by the fact that we have statins, which end up being, a $500 billion industry. Where do you think that stemmed from? Do you think that stemmed from people actually thought statins were going to fix the problem? Or was it just like a narrative that was being pushed? Like, how did we get that so wrong?
Yeah, the great question. To be clear, yes. The thought was statins had solved heart disease, right? We had figured out what caused heart disease, having a high LDL cholesterol level, and we had the treatment, statins. Again, it's interesting, right, to think about this history because it's recent history. Statins come on the market late 1980s, right? Early 90s. They become the most widely prescribed class of medication and have pretty much stayed that way, right? We have newer versions of the statins and we have other medications now to attack the cholesterol problem. But it was very much decided, right, that heart disease was solved. It was about cholesterol. And as long as we could control people's cholesterol, right, and that was through dietary means, and that was through medications, pharmaceuticals, as long as we control people's heart disease, people's cholesterol, we're going to eliminate heart disease. And what's interesting is as you follow that narrative, right? And again, my career has overlapped with this because we did start to see, right? It's interesting when you look at the number of deaths from heart disease. We'll focus on that statistic because I think it's kind of clean, right? You die or you don't die. Now, whether or not you died from heart disease, with heart disease, there is some stuff that goes into that. But, when you just look at the number of deaths in the United States, right, you see a peak a little after 1980s, and then it starts to go down throughout the 90s and the 2000s, right? And people are taking more statins. The number of deaths from heart disease is going down, and everyone's like, great, this is going to be a downward trajectory. Many times it was projected that, cancer would pass heart disease as the number one cause of death. And, again, we had it solved. But then something curious started happening that plateaued, right? The number of deaths stopped going down throughout the early 2000s. And about 2010, it starts to go up again. And it is now, the most recent statistics from 2023, actually, these statistics just came out. They're about a 8 to 10 month lag on them always. But we are now almost back to that peak level that we hit around 1985 or so. So it's clearly not getting better, right? Now, I see something even more, what I would say, concerning, right, in my life as a heart surgeon. And that's the age of the people that I'm operating on, right? So when does the heart disease start? When I started my career, 20 plus years ago, right, we operated on 70 and 80-year-olds. We would have some 60-year-olds. The 50-year-olds were kind of rare. Today, I routinely operate on 40-year-olds. People in their 40s are needing heart surgery. They have advanced heart disease, and it's really not that unusual anymore that I see someone in their 30s needing these operations. So more so than heart disease just becoming more common, right? It's also striking people younger and younger. And this should really be setting off the alarm bells because, yes, we're better at keeping people with heart disease alive, right? And this is where the controversy around some of these statistics come into play, right? We're better at keeping people alive with heart disease, but we are not making heart disease go away in any sense of the word. And I challenge, anyone to show me statistics that say that we are doing a better job at avoiding heart disease. We have better technology to manage it and keep people alive longer is the only real progress we've made in the heart disease front.
And I think there was a statistic, I believe it was the 1960s, that 50% of people that had a heart attack died. And that's where we're better at. Like now it's like,
right.
Typically, like somebody's going to be like, I had somebody who did, but typically you don't die from your first heart attack. And so, yeah, exactly what you said. We're just better at keeping people alive.
Exactly. That number that you referred to, it's down to probably the 15 to 20% range of people that die, from their first heart attack, where it used to be, like you said, 50, 60% even. So we're better at that. But we really, when you look at the medical system, right, it really has no idea how to prevent heart disease. We have done an incredibly lousy job at this. And again, I think the reason is because we've been distracted by cholesterol and we've been told it's all about cholesterol. And it clearly isn't, right? There may be some argument about, is cholesterol relevant at all? And honestly, I do think it is, right? And this is one of the things that maybe sometimes in our low carb carnivore community, sometimes we go a little bit too far and people will say that cholesterol is meaningless. It's not meaningless. It's just a minor player in the story. And we know that there are more significant factors, things like inflammation, things like insulin resistance, right, that actually get addressed incredibly well by low carb carnivore diets and clearly aren't being caused by red meat. And yet red meat continues to be villainized when it comes to heart health because of this erroneous association with cholesterol, right? And we can get into the whole that how much red meat you eat probably has very little influence on your cholesterol to start with. But, even if it did, right, cholesterol isn't and shouldn't be our main focus when it comes to heart disease. And so that's really the mission that I've been on, is trying to, educate people on that, educate my fellow physicians on that we clearly have to go beyond cholesterol. Clearly, cholesterol isn't the answer because you know what? We're doing a pretty good job at managing people's cholesterol, right? When you look at cholesterol levels across the population, they have gone down. When you look at the types of fat and the amount of fat that people are consuming in their diets, right? They eat less fat, they eat way less saturated fat, and yet heart disease is not going away. More and more people are on these medications to lower their cholesterol. They're on more powerful medications to lower their cholesterol, and heart disease is not going away. So, I'm kind of here now looking at the world around me in the cardiac space and sort of banging my head against the wall saying, how many times do we need to repeat these experiments, right? How many times do we need to say, oh, we didn't start soon enough, or people's cholesterol levels aren't low enough, right? For us to recognize that cholesterol is not the ultimate answer.
Yeah. And I have a couple questions to go into that, but I want to jump back a little bit and talk about how you made this mindset shift. And I know it happened with personal, which I actually saw a little clip of you and you. So you have the book behind you, Stay Off My Operating Table. And you described how you had this realization that if you didn't change something, you were going to end up on your own operating table. What caused that mindset shift and how did that play out in changing how you viewed cardiac in general?
Yeah. So, and again, I would say it's a story that we're increasingly hearing, right? It was physician heal thyself, as the saying goes, because I was a morbidly obese pre-diabetic heart surgeon. I had reached a point, this is going back about 10 years now, that, like I said, I was very clearly headed for my own operating table. I was following that same path that so many of my patients had followed. And like so many of them, I was kind of at a loss about what to do because, I'm not going to say I was perfect, right? But I think I was doing a pretty good job at following the advice that I had been taught. Eat a low-fat diet, eat less, move more, count your calories, all of that stuff, right? And despite that, I had gotten to this point, right, that I'm morbidly obese, I'm pre-diabetic. Going back to my childhood, obesity was always a struggle for me. And, what's interesting about the way that I was raised, right, the household I grew up in, my older brother was a type 1 diabetic. So we did not have sugar in the house, right? We were all aboard everything was the low fat, right? We had the margarine instead of the butter. We had skim milk on our Wheaties and our Cheerios for breakfast every morning. We were following the food pyramid, right? And I continued to follow that throughout my teenage, college, and early career as a heart surgeon. And that's where it got me. Morbidly obese, pre-diabetic. I have a family history of heart disease, and I was headed for the table. And, I started to kind of, I guess you could say, wake up, right? And ask why, like what's happening here. And thankfully, I started to get exposed to some different information that I didn't learn in medical school. I didn't learn from my colleagues. One of my kind of, part of my origin story around all this is I happened to be at a meeting of heart surgeons, Society of Thoracic Surgeons. And there was a guest lecturer by the name of Gary Taubes. And of course, your audience is going to be familiar with him. I wasn't at the time. And, I'm kind of sitting there, right? And you can picture the scene. You got 1,000+ heart surgeons in a room, big conference hall. And, you're kind of looking through your agenda, right? We were in Phoenix, Arizona, January, beautiful weather. And I'm like, what's this journalist like talking to us about, right? Why am I here? I'm here to learn about heart surgery. But, thankfully, I stayed for the talk. And Gary at that time had just written the case against sugar. And, first time I heard these concepts of, the types of food that you eat being more important than the amount of food that you eat. And, things like insulin resistance. And so I read Gary's, I read the case against sugar and why we get fat and good calories, bad calories. And I started on a low carb, low sugar diet. And I started to lose, weight quickly, noticed how much better I felt, ultimately lost about 100 pounds. And then, I reached that inevitable sort of point that we all reach, right? That I'm eating, increasing amounts of meat. Right? I'm eating this low carbohydrate diet. I'm eating a lot of fat, right? Kind of ketogenic, high fat diet. I'm feeling better. My numbers are looking better. But, my God, the heart, right? The heart disease, the cholesterol. And started looking into that aspect of it and came across, again, guys like David Diamond and Dave Feldman and, Asim Malhotra and all these people, that started bringing out this other narrative around cholesterol and heart disease. And that's what ultimately, realizing the information that's out there, that's been out there, it just doesn't get communicated to doctors, that shows, the problems with the cholesterol-centric narrative around heart disease. That's what really opened my eyes and really got me thinking about, I have to do something different for my patients, let alone for myself, which I had already made the changes. And that's what led me, to where I am today, where I continue to do the heart surgery, but I also am actively trying to keep people off the operating table and teach them how not to need heart surgery. Because the other thing I came to realize is that the vast majority of what we do as heart surgeons shouldn't need to be done. And the reality is there isn't a shortage of heart surgeons in the country. There's too many people that need heart surgery. And that's how we need to attack this problem. And we can. And I'm seeing the success stories every day now in my, preventative health practice that I have, in addition to my surgery practice. And I know that we can. And I think it's incumbent on us as physicians to do this, to keep people off the operating table and to help them be healthy instead of just being there to take care of them when they're sick.
So my question is, it's easy to get in a bubble in social media, right? I see the cardiologists who attack you for your views on cholesterol. There's a couple that I won't name. And you get this idea because people express it. They're like, every cardiologist in the world, especially when the consensus statement came out from the European Atherosclerosis Society. And cardiologists are on the internet saying, this is the consensus of every cardiologist ever. Like, that's on video. And so you get this idea that all these cardiologists think this way, and the few that don't are extreme outliers. What is it in the real world? Like, is it still 99% of cardiologists feel this way? Or is there more towards a shift of, hey, maybe we don't have this right. Maybe it's not just cholesterol, and maybe we should find other ways to look at it.
Yeah, so I think I am starting to see this shift in maybe it's not just cholesterol, right? I don't think for the vast majority of cardiologists, they're not willing to say that, we've been approaching cholesterol wrong, right? And maybe people shouldn't be on these medications, and maybe the low-fat diet isn't quite the answer, right? But they are starting to say, I think they're starting to wake up to the fact that's around them every day, which is we've been recommending these things for 50 years. We've been treating people with this paradigm, and it's not making the situation better. And there are more and more sick people in front of me, right? And the average cardiologist, I can tell you, is overwhelmed. The average doctor is overwhelmed because there are so many damn sick people, right? And they're starting to ask why. And I think that's a great first step. And honestly, when I talk to my colleagues, right, I don't go right at, I don't say, you're wrong about cholesterol, right? Cholesterol is bullshit, right? That's not the approach I take. I say, let's talk about insulin resistance. Let's talk about inflammation. Clearly, these things play a role. So why aren't we addressing them? And, okay, you want to, you've been trained to take care of the cholesterol. Great. It's not working. What do we do now? And that is what I think opens up their mind, opens up the conversation. And okay, let's talk about insulin resistance. Let's talk about inflammation. Let's talk about the things that we can do. And then, we're going to talk about the fact that the best way to lower insulin resistance is a low carbohydrate diet. And then, okay, so if you take out the carbs, you got to add fat, right? Because you got to eat something. And then, so let's talk about what we've gotten wrong about fat, right? And saturated fat, this has been something, this may be one of the biggest medical errors, we'll call it, in history, systemic medical errors, thinking that saturated fat was the problem. And, I know you've probably had guests on talk about how we came to that and what was involved in that. And, the science being either very poor and or fraudulent. But irregardless of that, right, we now have the definitive evidence we need to say that saturated fat is not a problem in the diet. And, we now have multiple meta-analyses. There was just another one released within the past month or two, that looked at all the evidence on saturated fat and once again concluded that dietary consumption of saturated fat has nothing to do with the development of heart disease. And there is no evidence to suggest that we should be restricting saturated fat in the diet. And again, when you ask, this is something that, doctors don't think about. They just have been told, right? They've been programmed, red meat bad for health, right? And you just ask, well, why is red meat bad for your health, right? And inevitably they're going to say, well, because it has saturated fat in it. Okay, well, we now know that saturated fat is not bad for your health. So why else might red meat be bad for you? And that's where they kind of hit the wall, right? And maybe they come up with something else, right? TMAO or one of these other things that they'll throw out there. But the bottom line is there is nothing in red meat that is bad for our health. We have been eating it for our entire existence as human beings. And we now have more and more people, right? And this is something else that just can't be ignored anymore. The increasing amount of people that are eating lots of red meat without the processed food that was part of the standard Western diet that kind of villainized red meat to start with. They're just eating lots of red meat, and their health is improving in every measure we can look at, except maybe this one blood test that, like I said, maybe we misinterpreted that to start with. But that's how I start to open this conversation. And I do see doctors, more and more doctors, being open to that, at least, because they are frustrated, right? What they're doing is not working. And ultimately, I know that most doctors are very good people, right? And all they want to do is help. And what they're doing is not helping the people around them, their patients, and that's getting them frustrated. And I think that opens the window of opportunity. And now, thankfully, here we are, recording this in December, a month after the election and about 6 weeks away from, President Trump starting his second term, with RFK as his health advisor, who is talking nonstop about this. And he is talking about the food that we're eating and, that we need to make America healthy again. And we do, because being unhealthy is having serious detrimental effects on society. It is literally threatening like our very existence as a country and as a society. It's financially bankrupting us. It's getting us to the point that we don't have enough healthy people to have a military, all of these things that are very concerning. And so I'm very excited to see this taking prominence in the national conversation. And I think the next few years, at least we're going to be able to talk about these problems and say things like, maybe we got saturated fat and red meat wrong.
Yeah, I love being able to hear outside of social media, because social media, you just hear like the loudest people, right? And it can be frustrating for people, especially who do carnivore, especially who have elevated LDL, when experts, right, like PhDs in nutrition, cardiologists, MDs, will flat out tell you your diet's unhealthy, right? I have on video a PhD of nutrition that says for most people, a standard American diet would be healthier than the carnivore diet. And I'm like, okay, so it's hard, even in my lens, it's hard not to be like, wow, all PhDs in nutrition are absolute idiots, right? So it's good to hear real world, but it's frustrating when a lot of people, and I've talked to, individuals who are told by their doctor, you got to change your diet, even though you've lost a ton of weight, your insulin has improved, your HbA1c's improved, your blood pressure's improved, all of these measurable, all of which you can go find studies that link them to increased risk of heart disease. All of these are getting better, but you have one number and they say, okay, you either have to change your diet or you have to go on a statin. And that's crazy. So it's good that people are starting to realize, okay, maybe we need to change something up. And that's why I'm also excited about this Make America Healthy movement. Maybe we need to look at the food that we're eating, because the food that we're eating is obviously causing a problem somewhere.
Yeah, I think that problem has gotten too big to ignore, right? And we realize that there are powerful forces, right, that maybe don't want to talk about that problem, but it is coming into the conversation. And yes, of course, there's going to be the usual sort of, back and forth about what particular component of the food it is, right? And that's honestly how we got into this, right? We can go back to 70 years ago when that realization first came to be, right? Heart disease became an epidemic, what's causing heart disease? And, rightfully so, it was decided it was the food that we were eating. And the problem is that there were two components, two camps about what in the food that we were eating was problematic. Was it the fat? Was it the sugar? And honestly, we chose the wrong path, right? And I can forgive that. Yes, there were some things that went on that were certainly, I would say, a little bit suspicious, but, we made a choice, right? We didn't have all the information we needed at that time. We didn't understand things to the detail we understand them now. We made a choice. And here we are 70 years later. The experiment has been run. The experiment has failed. So I think it's time to go back and look at that choice that we made. And I think a lot of the discussions around food are coming around to that, right? Because what I see on the big picture level is people are starting to realize that processed food is the issue. right? And think about, what is processed food? Why did it come to be? Well, one of the primary drivers of why we have so much processed food is because we decided we needed to take the fat out of food, right? You have to process it to do that. And that's what led to all of this processed food all around us. And so when you say, okay, let's get rid of the processed food, what do you have left? You have whole, real food. You have meat, you have vegetables, and honestly, and this is, again, like you talked about, social media can become a bit of a bubble. And, you can say, the carnivores versus the vegans, right? Honestly, if you're eating whole, real food, I think there's an argument to be made, right? That is going to be better than the standard diet, whether it's carnivore or vegan, right? And, and then I think there's a lot of middle ground in between where most people are going to fall that, you'll do pretty well at. I know carnivore has some unique advantages, right? I know that eating meat is essential to human health. We cannot get all the nutrients we need from plants alone. Not a debatable fact. We can get all the nutrients we need from meat alone. Not a debatable fact. But make your choice. Figure out where you want to be on that spectrum between, somewhere between all meat and all veggies. What I want people to understand is that an all meat diet, a carnivore diet, is a legitimate option. It is not harming your health. It is not harming your heart health. And that's the message that we need to get out there. But first and foremost, it really comes down to eat whole, real food, right? If you do that, you're going to end up in a pretty good place.
So how I got to carnivore was through Animal Based with Paul Saladino. And one of the things I appreciated is he's on podcasts saying, hey, if you're thriving eating vegan, fine, do it. Right. And I'm the same thing, like get rid of processed food and you're going to be better. Now, do I think there's advantages? Yes. But I definitely think it's the processed food. So for you, if it's not cholesterol, right? If it's not LDL, like a ton of bodies that would be, say it is, what is causing these increases in heart disease? Like what are we doing to ourselves? And what is the measurable biohealth marker that's indicating we might be on a trajectory for heart disease as an individual?
Yeah. So to me, it's clearly insulin resistance, first and foremost. And again, this has been very well demonstrated. We can go back to the work of Gerald Reaven in the 1970s, the 1980s, and he demonstrated that someone presenting with heart disease has insulin resistance, almost guaranteed. It was like 90 to 95% if you test for it the right way. Now, this is the difficulty, right? Because testing for diagnosing insulin resistance is not as easy as looking at one number, your LDL cholesterol. And this was part of the challenge, I think, around insulin resistance. And then the second challenge then became, okay, we have a drug that lowers LDL cholesterol. Easy to do. Look at the number, write the prescription, don't think about it, right? This is how doctors were basically trained. Whereas insulin resistance, not as straightforward, right? We don't have the simple test to diagnose it, although there are some simple things that people can look at that we'll talk about. And the treatment isn't as simple, right? We know that telling people to change their diet can be challenging. Change your lifestyle can be challenging. But that's the treatment for it. And insulin resistance is the primary driver. It is the root cause of heart disease. Now, it becomes interesting, right? Because it turns out that being insulin resistant then affects your cholesterol. And this is where the linkage between cholesterol and heart disease really comes from. It's not so much about the amount of cholesterol. It becomes about the quality of your cholesterol and the size of your cholesterol, particles and all of this. And again, more complicated. It's not as simple as look at one number and write the prescription. And this is where I think doctors need to kind of take agency, take back control, right? Because if it really was as simple as look at the number, write the prescription, you don't need doctors for that, right? You don't need anything for that. You need AI, right? Very simple to do. You don't even need AI for that, right? You can write a program in and I'll date myself, right? I can go write a program in basic programming language to say, take this number and decide whether or not to write the prescription. It's clearly not that simple, but insulin resistance is the primary driver of heart disease. Every study, that looks at it properly comes to that same conclusion. And so we can't ignore that any longer. And that's what we, as a heart disease specialist, right? I now know that I need to focus on insulin resistance. Now, what's interesting about insulin resistance is the heart disease specialist needs to focus on it. The endocrinologist managing diabetes needs to focus on it. The doctors that are worried about Alzheimer's disease needs to focus on it. The oncologist worried about cancer needs to focus on it, because it turns out that insulin resistance is the root cause of not only heart disease, but all of these chronic diseases that we're seeing around us. And that's the other power of all of this, that, I now can say, well, I'm not just treating heart disease, right? I'm helping that person in front of me to improve all of these related conditions because they all come from the same root cause. And that's what's so powerful about insulin resistance, metabolic health, however you want to, whatever you want to call it. It's the root cause of all of this chronic disease that we're facing. And that needs to be our primary focus.
Yeah, so I've done a bunch of research on that, and it comes back with that insulin resistance, insulin resistance, insulin resistance. How do people develop insulin resistance? Because I think this is also part of it. It's like, on the surface, it seems pretty cut and dry, right? Like your body it's not good at dealing with insulin. So you have elevated insulin levels, but insulin tests don't necessarily do that. So how do people even get down that path? And then once they are, how do they even realize that they have insulin resistance?
Yeah. So I think, again, to try and keep it simple, right? I like to start with the 5 basic measures of metabolic health, which is, akin to insulin resistance, right? And you look at your waist circumference, and you look at your blood pressure, and you look at your blood glucose levels, and you look at your HDL cholesterol, and you look at your triglycerides. And those 5 numbers can, give you a pretty good sense of where you stand when it comes to insulin resistance. The statistics around it are scary, right? We know that 93%, right, in the most recent studies we have of the adults in the United States are unhealthy, right? They don't meet all 5 of those measures being in the optimal range. And so they have some degree of insulin resistance and poor metabolic health. But just start there, right? And that's not that complicated. Now, the insulin level, right? Your fasting insulin level is a great test that I think what I tell people, they're like, what should I ask my doctor for? I say, just ask for the fasting insulin level, right? Because it's a test that most doctors don't do. They may not even know how to interpret it correctly, right? But it's cheap, it's easy to do, and it opens up the conversation at least. It may not be the whole answer. There are some complicating factors when it comes to looking at your insulin level, but it's a start. And that, can get people in the right direction. So, that's how I usually start with people. And that usually gives us an indication, right? If it's not obvious, and we have to acknowledge this, it's obvious that probably 80% of us are insulin resistant, right? I don't need any blood test. I can just look at your basic health factors, right? The medications you're on and, your weight, right? Your waist circumference, and tell that you're metabolically unhealthy and you're insulin resistant. And I don't really need the fancy blood tests, but, I end up getting the blood tests with people, right? Because it reinforces it to them. And then it gives them those metrics that they can see improve over time. And that's really what's most rewarding about this approach, is you see the people improving, in real time, right? And these changes start to happen pretty quickly. My telemedicine practice has become very interesting, right? Because I have, you call up my practice, right? And you're like, I want to see Dr. Ovadia. And it's, 3 or 4 months before you can get on my calendar. But, in the meantime, you start working with my health coaches and with my nurse practitioner. And what's been amazing is by the time the patients get to see me, 3 months after they made the call and signed up, they're already noticeably better. And we can see the improvements in their blood work already, quite frankly, without having to see me, right? And again, drives my business people crazy because I'm telling people to stay off my operating table. And I'm here telling you that, you come join my practice and you get better even before you see me, right? It kind of goes against the business strategy ultimately, but I love seeing it. And it's very rewarding to see how these people are improving. And then, my practice obviously has sort of a specialty focus on heart disease. So we get into the nitty gritty around all of that. And that's what you do need, I guess, the doctor for. But this is something that people can make meaningful improvement in their lives very quickly. And it's all about people taking control of their own health. Don't wait for the doctor to do this for you. Don't wait for Bobby Kennedy and the government to do this for you. Take charge today of your health, make the changes, start eating whole, real food, start getting more activity, make sure you get good sleep, make sure you get out in the sun, lift some weights and manage your stress. And that's going to get you to good health, good heart health, and good overall health.
So this is the other cool thing that I get to do. So just the other day, I talked to Dr. Ben Bickman, who's a cell scientist, right? He studies insulin. He grows fat cells, uses insulin in a lab. He's a professor. And that was his number one recommendation. He goes, address insulin first, and then worry about everything else. And then I just talked to Dr. Sean O'Mara, and he listed 5 things for visceral fat. And they're exactly what you are. They're the foods that you eat, carbohydrates, sleep, stress. I'm going to forget the other 2. But, he's like exercise. And so you start talking to all these people with completely different backgrounds. Like you're in cardiac, he's in emergency medicine. We have PhDs with scientists. I talked to Dr. Lisa Wiedemann, who's an optometrist. Same kind of thing. Like everybody's slowly getting there. And I think we're all starting to finally realize that it just can be so overwhelming for people when you have these people who are supposed to be specialists. You have the dietitians, you have the PhDs, you have the cardiologists that are all saying different things. And then you're like, that's not working though, right? Like it's just not working. And then it's nice to see a collective group from all different specialties finally getting together without even necessarily talking to each other and all coming to realization that we got to address the insulin. And that's a lot of it's from our lack of sleep, our lack of, our poor food, our lack of exercise, and on and on and on. So that's, I love seeing that. So so whole foods, right? But what do you think in our American diet is the biggest factor for insulin resistance? Is it just the fact that we're eating sugars, the fact that we're eating processed sugar? Is it all the additives, the environmental? Like, what specifically does this Make America Healthy movement need to address in order for a population-wide to, like you said, 90% of people probably have some form of insulin resistance?
Yeah. So again, I come back to the processed food, right? And that includes the processed fats, the vegetable and seed oils, and the highly refined carbohydrates, the processed sugars. And I don't think we can separate the two, to be honest, right? I don't think we can say it's one versus the other. We can look at the vegetable and seed oils. We can see the effects that they have on the mitochondria, right? That, we can look at all of that, but we can't separate the fact, right, that these two things just are together in our food supply, and we need to get rid of both of them, right? And, I think, honestly, a metabolically healthy person, a person without insulin resistance, can tolerate some sugar, right? They can tolerate some non-processed carbohydrates, and, a baked potato is a whole real food, right? And I think if you're metabolically healthy, I don't have any problem with you eating a baked potato, right? I don't think it provides any unique advantages. I don't think it's mandatory to eat the baked potato or the vegetables like we've been told, but they're not what is doing the harm. So again, you keep coming back to processed food, right? And no, we can't separate out the components, and there's no reason to, right? I don't want to get us to a point where we're just saying, okay, how do we make better processed food? Right? That's not the answer. It's not going to be the answer. The answer is eat the whole real food, the stuff that grows in the ground and the things that eat the things that grow in the ground. And that's what's going to get us back to health. And yes, there are some things that are unique about vegetable and seed oils. Yes, there are some things that are, unique about highly refined carbohydrates and especially the amounts of them that we're consuming. But I think the answer really does come back to, eat whole, real food first and foremost. And, you kind of don't have to worry about it, right? Whether it's the vegetable and seed oils, whether it's the highly refined carbohydrates, just cut it out, eat the whole, real food. And that's what I think is going to get us to the place we need to be.
It goes back to the people who are against this. Like, they're the ones who are putting up such a fight, right? It's not the food. It's not, they will try to separate it and they'll go, see, look at this additive. It doesn't cause any problems. Hey, look at Diet Coke. You have to drink 15 Diet Cokes a day, every single day, to even potentially get cancer. Look at the preservatives, look at the seed oils. And I think you're right. I don't think we need to separate it. It's okay. The dose might make the poison. I hate that phrase. But when you have glyphosate in your food, and you have seed oils, and you have preservatives, and you have food dye, and you have all of these things, it's probably a combination of all of them, right? Like, and I 100% am with you. Yeah, I'm all about let's get rid of the food dye, but we also just need to take a step back and realize that the processed food in general, because if you eliminate processed foods, you go back to the whole foods. And I've discovered, and a lot of people have, the longer I've been on carnivore, the more I can tolerate other foods. And it doesn't cause any problems because my metabolic health has improved significantly in virtually every measurable way.
Yeah, same, thing that I see over and over in the people I work with and in myself. It just, ultimately, right, I come back to carnivore because of, things we mentioned early, right? There are unique nutrients that are available in meat that we can't get anywhere else. So I think it is essential to eat meat. Yes, you can do a vegan diet with supplements and maintain health or improve health that way. I think it becomes increasingly hard to maintain over time. But, I come back to carnivore just because it's simple, right? The kind of eat meat, be happy. I don't have to really worry about it too much. And you're right. I'm not the type of person that needs to be super strict about it, right? I don't have an autoimmune condition. I can tolerate eating other things. And I do on an occasional basis, but on a day-to-day basis, carnivore is just simple. It meets my needs, right? It meets my nutrient needs. It keeps me satiated, satisfied, right? I'm not hungry all the time. I eat my poundish or so of meat, once a day or so, maybe twice a day, depending on my schedule. It just works. And that I think is ultimately the message. And I think most people in the carnivore community are actually pretty reasonable around this, right? I do sometimes get a little taken aback, right, when we become evangelical about it and say, if you eat anything besides meat, right, it's going to kill you. Honestly, no, it's not. We can't go that far, right? There are a few people that's kind of true for. They have these bad autoimmune conditions that, the plants are triggering and they need to be super strict. But for the average person out there, you don't. The carnivore diet is a great framework. It's a great base. And then we just need to, like we talked about earlier, right, undo this sort of misconception about red meat being bad for your heart, red meat being bad for your health. We have to get people to understand it is fine to eat red meat. It never was the problem in our food supply. It never will be. And it took the blame, right? Like you said, it was the divide and conquer strategy. Blame the red meat, blame the sugar people are blaming the vegetable and seed oils. Vegetable and seed oil manufacturers are blaming the sugar in the red meat. And that's how you get people confused enough to, accept this notion that the food that has been around us naturally for millions of years is bad for us. And instead we need to eat all of this created food stuff, right? That's going to be the path to good health.
Yeah, that's the one that gets me. It just, and I just try to tell people, just try it, right? Like, you've been eating garbage 40 years. It's not going to kill you to try it for 30 days. And I'm the same way. I don't have to be carnivore. I don't have an autoimmune condition. I just always end up carnivore because I feel better. I'm someone that likes to do experiments. I did an experiment where I ate standard American diet. I ate 4,000 calories of standard American diet for 3 weeks. And I had some bad reactions to it because this was like gorging myself with Twinkies on purpose. And that was the first time I realized that I don't think it was the LDL, because my LDL went down like 70%. And I was like, wait a minute. You're like this. If I continue to do this, I would end up morbidly obese. Like I'd be morbidly obese and die by the time I'm 50. But a cardiologist is going to go, that's good. Your LDL's better. I'm like, okay, something's wrong here. So I completely agree. It's like, get rid of the processed foods first. And then I think just continue to experiment. And I think a lot of people end up carnivore because they're like, yeah, I just kept going. Like I felt better with this, and then I removed that, and I ended up, and it's easy, and it's being hungry and being satiated is the number one reason that I continue with it.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, right? And it is all about the way you feel and the energy levels and the mental clarity. We're recording this podcast, right? It's 5:00 in the evening where I am. I was up most of last night doing an emergency operation, ended up getting like 3 or 4 hours sleep. And yet, I still feel great. I have the energy, and, that is very different from the way I used to live and I used to be. And I think most people, that try this, like you said, and I do the same thing. I'm like, listen, give it a try, right? I am very confident in saying today that eating a carnivore diet for 30 days is not going to kill you. It's not going to make your heart explode, despite what, maybe some of the cardiologists out there want us to believe. So give it a try and see how you feel. Again, I'm not evangelical about it, right? And, but I just see what's happening around me. And I see that more and more people, when they try it, they have the same experiences that, you and I have had, right? And they feel great and their health improves and they decide to stick with it because it just works. And so that's, the shared mission I think we're all on here, to try and get that message out to more and more people, to make them comfortable enough to try it, and then help them to deal with the naysayers, right? Whether that's their doctors or their family or friends who are saying, oh, you can't eat all that red meat, it's going to kill you. And ultimately, it seems to be making traction, right? And it's great to see attention being paid to this. And I do think it is becoming better accepted. It's not the mainstream yet. We got a long way to go, but we're making progress.
Absolutely. You heard it, guys, from a man whose job is to literally break people's chests open and operate on their hearts. Dr. Ovadia, I really, really appreciate you coming on today and making the time. To everybody that tuned in, thank you very much. Go check out Dr. Ovadia, and we will see you guys next time.